Tom, we'll take 3 more minutes till what, like, I think we already, I think, have all the people who signed up, but I'll just take 3 more minutes in case someone else is signing up.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you right now? Are you in the Bay Area?
Yeah, I'm in Lafayette, so I'm 12 miles east of Berkeley.
Amazing. Guys, to everyone in the audience, it would mean the world to me specifically if you guys can switch on your cameras so you can see, so Tom can see you. It just makes for a better talk environment. I understand if that's not possible, that's okay. But for those of you who can, that would be amazing. Perfect. Shall we get started, guys?
Yeah, so we'll start by introducing ourselves. My name is Radha. I'm in 10th grade at the Harker School here in Silicon Valley, and I'm super passionate about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So I built a platform to spread awareness about it called SDG Forum. And my co-hosts for today's session are Janani and Nandan. So let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Janani, and I go to the International School in Bangalore, and I'm in 9th grade. I'm super passionate about climate change as well, so I built an extension called Footprints, which tracks your carbon footprint on your commutes. Now I would like to introduce Nandan.
Hi, I'm Nandan. I am in the 11th grade at Malayaditi International School in Bangalore. I am really passionate about public policy and improving people's lives. Currently, I run an initiative providing food to migrant workers who are negatively impacted by the pandemic called Project HD. I'm also working on a platform to help show people different perspectives on divisive issues.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce our distinguished guest for today's session, Mr. Tom Khalil. So Tom Khalil is the Chief Innovation Officer at Schmidt Futures. Schmidt Futures is Eric Schmidt's philanthropic initiative that finds exceptional students across the globe and helps them do more for others together. Tom leads initiatives to harness technology for societal challenges, improve science policy, and identify and pursue 21st century moonshots.
Prior to Schmidt Futures, Tom served in the White House for President Barack Obama and President Bill Clinton, helping design and launch national science and technology initiatives.
During the Obama administration, Tom reported directly to the president and headed the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. His work included leading advancements in nanotechnology, the BRAIN Initiative, data science, materials by design, robotics, commercial space, high-speed networks, access to capital for startups, high-skill immigration, STEM education, learning technology, startup ecosystems, and the federal use of incentive prizes.
From 2001 to 2008, Tom was Special Assistant to the Chancellor for Science and Technology at UC Berkeley. He launched a program called Big Ideas at Berkeley, which provides grants to student-led teams committed to solving important problems at home and abroad.
In 2007 and 2008, Tom was the chair of the Global Health Working Group for the Clinton Global Initiative, where he developed new public and private sector initiatives in areas such as maternal health, child health, undernutrition, and vaccines. We are beyond excited to have Tom with us here.
So for starters, could you just give us like a key highlights of your work at the White House?
Sure. So I'll tell you about one thing that I worked on for President Obama. So one question that I used to ask people who would come to visit me is to ask, in the same way that President Kennedy said, let's put astronauts on the moon and have them safely return by the end of the decade, and we also made a decision to sequence the entire human genome and drive down the cost of that from $100 million to $1,000, what are the similarly ambitious goals that we should be setting in the 21st century? And a group of researchers contacted me in in late 2011, and they said, we think we have an idea for one of these grand challenges or moonshots. We think it's time to launch an initiative that would dramatically increase our understanding of how the brain encodes and processes information. How do we go from 80 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses to all the amazing things that the human brain is capable of doing, whether it's learning, memory, perception, action, self-awareness. And what it's going to require, excuse me, is an investment in tools that will allow us to study the brain in action. So right now, we can either measure a very small number of neurons in high levels of temporal and spatial resolution, or we can take a fuzzy picture of your entire brain using something like fMRI, but we can't do anything in the middle. We can't measure the real-time interaction of, say, 100,000 or 1 million neurons. And so I thought this is a pretty interesting idea, and together we worked with the neuroscientists in the department and agencies across the government. They thought it was a good idea, and ultimately it's something that President Obama decided to support. And then the Congress, usually the way the Congress works is that when they provide the budget for an initiative like this, they only provide the funding 1 year at a time. So every year they have to make a decision about whether they're going to continue to support it. In this instance, they actually provided 10 years of funding for the participation of the National Institutes of Health in this initiative, which has really allowed the research community to plan for the long term. And my hope is that this initiative will lead to increased understanding of how the brain works. Ultimately, it could improve our ability to diagnose, treat, prevent, and cure diseases of the brain. And it might lead to advances in computer science, because the human brain is capable of doing a lot of things that computers and algorithms can't do. And by studying the brain, it could also lead to technological advances as well. So I think that's an example of something that I worked on, obviously not by myself. And I wasn't the person who came up with the idea, it was really the research community. But working together, we were able to build a coalition that included the science agencies that would need to get behind this, agencies like the National Institutes of Health, DARPA, and the National Science Foundation that would be needed to support an initiative like this.
Wow, that's really amazing. So what did you study in college that influenced your career?
Yeah, so I got very interested in a topic called political economy, which tries to understand, for example, how do business and government interact in different, particularly advanced industrial countries. This was at a time, particularly in the late 80s, where we were having a discussion about whether the United States was losing its competitive edge, not only in traditional manufacturing sectors like autos or machine tools, but also high-tech industries like semiconductors. And there was a very interesting debate that was going on about, was this a problem? If it was a problem, what was driving it, and what should we do about it? So that's something that I got very interested in.
That's really fascinating. What drove you to work in policy entrepreneurship?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think I should explain what policy entrepreneurship is. And it's not like it's a field. It's an idea that several political scientists have had, and maybe by way of analogy to traditional entrepreneurship. So a traditional entrepreneur is generally identifying an unmet need in the marketplace and then creating a new venture to try to address that unmet need. Whereas a policy entrepreneur either may have a specific idea that they're interested in and is trying to figure out how to advance that idea, or in many cases, in my situation, I was very fortunate because lots of people were bringing me ideas. And then the policy entrepreneur is trying to figure out, how do I advance this? How do I go from an idea to something happening in the world? So for example, in the BRAIN initiative, that required convincing the leadership of the National Institutes of Health, the DARPA, the National Science Foundation, other agencies, and ultimately the President of the United States, that this was an idea that was really compelling, and that the President should include it in his budget submission, that the Congress should support that. So one way to think about policy entrepreneurship is you see a problem that you think is worth solving. You have an idea about how to solve it. And then you identify whose support you would need in order to move that idea forward. So the thought experiment that I used to pose to people is that you have a meeting with the president in the Oval Office, and he says, Radha, if you give me a good idea for advancing the SDGs, then I will call anyone on the planet. It can be a conference call, so there can be more than one person on the line. But you have to tell me not only what your idea is and why you're excited about it, but in order to make it happen, who would I call and what would I ask him to do? So the idea is that things generally happen when particular individuals and organizations take some action in the pursuit of some goal. So if you're trying to affect some change, you generally have to build a coalition. It's not something you can't just, sit in your room and solve the problem by yourself. You have to build a coalition. It's very difficult to build a coalition if you can't articulate who are the members of the coalition and what are the mutually reinforcing steps that you want them to take. So the building block of something happening in the world is some individual or organization takes some action in the pursuit of some goal. So A does B, so C. And if it's a complex effort, it may require many different individuals and organizations who are all taking some action that is aligned with the overall goals of the idea that you're trying to advance. So policy entrepreneurship is about having an idea or being exposed to a lot of ideas and then trying to figure out who would need to do what to advance this, and to see whether it's possible to get people to agree and to share your excitement and enthusiasm for the idea.
Right, so that sounds like a lot of steps to take to get to the end product. So what would you say is like the hardest part of being a policy entrepreneur?
Well, persistence is important because change usually doesn't happen overnight. You think about in the US, how long people were involved in the civil rights movement and how much progress we still have to make on an issue like racial justice, or how long people have been pushing for change on climate policy. Over the last several years, we've actually been going backwards rather than forwards from a policy point of view. So I think persistence is really important. I think another thing that's important is the ability to communicate effectively with multiple audiences. And this is one of the challenges I see with scientists and engineers, is that they're generally trained to talk to each other. If you have a roboticist or someone who works on computer vision, then they're generally trained to talk to other people in not even their field, in their subfield. But if I wanted to get something done in the White House, I would have to talk to the people responsible for managing our relationship with the press, with outside groups, with the Congress, the other policy councils who work not on science policy, but on economic or domestic policy or foreign policy, the Office of Management and Budget, which is responsible for putting together the president's budget, outside groups that either might be enthusiastic about the idea or have concerns about it. And all of those people have different backgrounds, have different ways of thinking about what constitutes for, success from their particular point of view. And the ability to communicate with a really broad range of audiences is very important for coalition building. Another thing is something that I call influence without authority. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times, if you're pushing for change, it's not like you're in a position to direct people, right? I can't say, you know, Manu, I want you to do the following. And because Manu doesn't work for me, right? I don't pay Manu's salary. So I have to convince, if I want Manu to do something, I have to convince him that it's the right thing to do, and that it's in his enlightened self-interest to do that thing. So being able to distinguish between influence and authority, and recognizing that you may be able to exert influence even if you don't have formal authority.
That makes a lot of sense. So what was actually the most exciting thing you did at the White House as the Deputy Director of Technology and Innovation?
Yeah, so one of the most exciting things that I did was I recruited people to come to the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and in many cases to join my team. And what was very exciting is, particularly after they'd been there for a while, they also learned these skills about how to go from an idea to something happening in the world. And they were working on everything from addressing undernutrition in developing countries, encouraging more young people to get excited about science, technology, engineering, and math, and going to Mars. So they were working on a really broad range of issues. And many of those young people have continued to work on the initiatives that they started at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So a woman, Jennifer Erickson, who worked for me, she was very committed to reducing the waiting list for an organ transplant. So many people require, say, a new kidney. They're on dialysis for a long time. The waiting list is very long. And so she's devoted a lot of energy to figuring out why that waiting list exists. So really understanding the problem and then trying to figure out what are the changes in policy and practice that would be required to reduce that waiting list. So that's one of the most exciting things, is to give people, they weren't all young, but many of them were in their 20s and 30s, an opportunity to serve, to see them get something done while they were working for President Obama, but to continue that work in their capacity as private citizens. And I think one of the things that they took away from that is a sense that more things in the world are changeable as opposed to being fixed. So, you know, obviously things like the laws of physics are fixed. They're not things that we can do anything about. We can't, it's probably very difficult for us to influence the speed of light, for example. But what Jennifer has figured out is that even though she's an individual citizen, she now has ways to be able to influence public policy. And so many things that people would regard as fixed, oh, you know, that's just the way things are. She now has what psychologists call agency. That is a sense that more things in the world are changeable because they're the result of human action or inaction. And she's learned more of the leverage points that are associated with change of that sort.
That
Uh,
was fantastic. Yeah, sorry.
yeah. That was a really cool answer. So you are currently the Chief Innovation Officer at Schmidt Futures. So besides having a super cool title, what does your job really entail?
Yeah, so again, uh, it involves identifying people who I think have a really important idea for improving the human condition, usually leveraging advances in science and technology to help solve a societal problem, and then seeing if it makes sense for Schmidt Futures to provide them support in two ways. One might be financial support, because a lot of these projects require financial resources. But again, also to think about who else would need to support their idea in order for it to move forward and whether we can help them build that coalition. Um, so since a number of you have expressed interest in climate change, I'll tell you about one team that we're supporting on climate change. So this effort is led by Saul Griffith, who is based in San Francisco. He's the CEO of something called the Other Lab. And a colleague of his, Alex Lasky, who is the co-founder of OPower, which is a startup that was using behavioral science to improve energy efficiency at the residential level. They have developed a proposal called Rewiring America. And the premise of the proposal is that there are a set of technologies that are now sufficiently mature so that the major obstacle to their wide-scale deployment is what the interest rate is. So if the average American household went out and purchased solar panels, electric appliances, and an EV battery, and an electric vehicle, they would actually be, if the interest rate at which they borrowed the money to buy all those things was low enough, they would be better off by $1,000 to $2,000 per year because the energy savings would more than offset the principal and interest. We also have to lower the cost of installation. So in the US, solar is far more expensive than it is in Australia, not because the actual panels are more expensive, but because what are referred to as the soft costs, the cost of installation and permitting, are a lot higher. So what he's done is to identify a series of things that if we changed, lowered the cost of borrowing the money for these technologies, lowering the cost of permitting and installation for solar, that Americans would have more money in their pockets. And if we had, really rapid deployment of these technologies, we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the US by 70%. And in the process, create 25 million jobs. So I think that this is a really exciting idea. And we're providing some funding for it and encouraging other philanthropists and foundations to get behind it as well.
So your job kind of includes going through cool ideas like this all the time. So what are future technologies that other future technologies that you're most excited about, or like what are you investing in right now at Schmidt Futures?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is the role that technology could play in education and lifelong learning. And one of the challenges that I see is that if you look at a lot of the ways in which technology is being used in the classroom today, it consists of a video of a professor giving a lecture. And the Sebastian Thrun, who's a Stanford professor and has been involved in multiple startups including one called Udacity, he says, you don't lose weight by watching someone else exercise.
Right.
And similarly, you know, watching a professor give a lecture is not likely to be the most effective way for someone to learn something. So learning by doing is really important. So I'm interested in uses of technology both for education and workforce development and lifelong learning that are going to go beyond a video of someone giving a lecture.
Right. So, what is some of the work that you did that makes you the most proud or has had the biggest impact, in your opinion?
Well, I talked about that, which was the recruiting people to the White House and not only have them accomplish significant things while they were there, but to have them increase their capacity to push for change even after they left.
So technology and public policy seem like two very different fields, especially coming from people in India where the education system is so rigidly divided into the sciences, commerce, and arts. So how do these two fields intersect?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a really interesting example of this, which the Ford Foundation in the US has been pushing. And that is what they call a public interest technologist. And specifically, what they have in mind is someone who both understands technology. Now, the way they're talking about it, when they say technology, they're referring primarily to information and communications technologies. But I think this is equally true in areas like the life sciences, not just information technology, but someone who understands both information technology and societal issues, ethics, law, public policy. And the reason that they're arguing that we need more of these people is that these technologies raise these profound policy issues, whether it's issues related to privacy or surveillance, or the impact that technology may be having on, in the US, for example, making US elections vulnerable to foreign interference, or the potential that social media creates these echo chambers and people become more and more polarized in terms of their views about politics and other societal issues. And so if you had more people who were bilingual, that is, they understood both technical issues and the ethical, legal, societal issues, then several things might happen. One is that the technology industry might be able to try to address more of these issues at the design stage. So, you know, the CEO of Twitter has said, if I knew at the beginning of Twitter what I know today, I would have hired different types of people. I wouldn't have hired just engineers. I would have hired social scientists or people in game theory or people in behavioral economics. So, you know, the first time something happens, you can say, well, that was an unintended consequence, right? But once it's happened over and over and over again, it's not legitimate for the technical industry, the technology industry, to say that was an unintended consequence because we've seen it happen multiple times. So that would be one benefit. That is that companies could hire people with a more diverse range of skills and to try to address some of these issues at the design stage. A second benefit to having more of these public interest technologists would be that some of them would go into jobs in public policy, and they would be able to help advise policymakers about the pros and cons of different options. Because obviously it's a problem if a policymaker says, well, we should take the following course of action, but actually that's not technically feasible, or even if it is feasible, the costs of that policy or the risks of that policy will far outweigh the benefits. So for example, if you're going to be making encryption policy, you want to know, if I'm going to go down that road, is that a technical option, number one? And number two, what are the costs and benefits? And am I pursuing something where the downsides and the costs may far outweigh the potential benefits?
Right, so you've brought to light a lot of issues through your work. So what would you say are the biggest challenges that the world faces right now?
Well, I think it depends whether you're talking about the sort of short term or the long term. I think obviously a big one is climate change. And I would say that's a big problem because we have a massive transformation in our energy system that we have to make in a short period of time. And it's a global problem. So you need, coordinated action by lots of different countries. And it's still, unfortunately, it's still something that many people view as, occurring in the future, as opposed to something that's having an impact on us today. So I would say that's a big one. I would say, more broadly, the question of sustainability. If we have 9 to 10 billion people on the planet by 2050, and we want more of those people to enjoy a more a higher standard of living, how do we do that in a way that is sustainable from an environmental point of view? So I would say those are a couple of big challenges. I would say in the US, one problem that we're having is, it's one thing to have different views about what direction the country should be going in, but we can't even agree on a shared set of facts. And so that makes political conversation more difficult.
Right.
If someone says, someone says the following is true, and the other is, then someone else says, oh, that's fake news. You read that in the New York Times. Then you have this sort of what philosophers call an epistemological problem. How do we know anything, right? And if I believe what I read in the New York Times and you believe what you see on Fox News, then we may have a very difficult time having a productive conversation about where the country should be headed.
Right, definitely. So what sparked your interest in nanotechnology and biotech?
Well, so I got interested in nanotechnology in the late 90s. And part of it was a function of the issue that I'd been working on beforehand, which was really the emergence of the internet. So in 1993, when I first started working for President Clinton, very few people had heard of the internet because it was not yet really a commercial phenomena, and very few people had seen it. And its usage was primarily confined to the research community. And so there were some very significant things that I could do by calling attention to it and identifying things that the government could do to advance it. Like we had an effort led by Vice President Gore to connect schools and libraries to the internet. We began to get government agencies online and begin publishing information and creating websites. We started looking at how the government would deliver government services online, addressing issues of, we created a moratorium on internet taxation, and had a framework for global electronic commerce. But by the late 90s, it wasn't necessary for me to go around and say that the internet was important because that was widely understood. And so I was interested in the question of what's next. And in the late 90s, I came across a group of researchers that were beginning to explore the field of nanoscale science and engineering. And it turns out that if you make something small enough, not only is it small, it starts to have novel and potentially useful properties. So that you could think about this as adding another dimension to the periodic table of elements. That is, you can tune the properties of materials by changing their size and shape. And I asked researchers if this is something that the federal government began to invest in, what might happen? And they said things that were totally incomprehensible. They said we might be able to store 10 to the 15th bits per cubic centimeter using molecular electronics and develop a nano-engineered MRI contrast agent and create a material with a Young's modulus of so many gigapascals. And after I understood what they were talking about I turned that into storing the Library of Congress in a device the size of a sugar cube, making materials that are stronger than steel and a fraction of the weight, and detecting cancerous tumors before they're visible to the human eye. And so armed with those examples, I was able to work with the science agencies and the research community and ultimately President Clinton to come up with something called the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which he announced in January of 2000. So during the last year of his administration, he announced that the federal government would double its investment in nanoscale science and engineering. And so fortunately, that effort has continued. You know, a lot of times you have areas where one president will do A, and then the next president comes in and immediately says, I want to do not A. And so we've seen that in the area of climate policy, for example. But this idea has enjoyed bipartisan support. It survived the transition from President Clinton to Bush to Obama and now to the current administration. And we're beginning to see exciting applications of seeing things like smart anti-cancer therapeutics that target tumors while leaving healthy cells untouched, or materials for better batteries, which are really important for electric vehicles, for example.
So we've just talked about the benefits of technology. So as much as technology can be used to help people, it can also be used for not so great purposes. So how do we restrict the negative use of technology and technological advancements while not limiting technological development and tech's ability to create change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And sometimes it relates to whether or not you're trying to control the technology or you're trying to control people's conduct in how they use that technology. So an example would be, you could say, people use cars to as getaway vehicles after a bank robbery. So we're going to regulate cars. Well, actually, we don't do that. We say, you know, robbing banks is illegal, and it doesn't matter whether or not you're, you know, using a car as the getaway vehicle. You know, if we find you, we're going to lock you up for a long time. So on the other hand, there are other instances where the risks of the technology, so like for example, the technology that is used to make nuclear weapons, we think that the benefits of the sort of or the risks of widespread availability of that technology are sufficiently high so that we really want to control the technology. So I think that's one of the hard parts, is when are you trying to identify conduct that you want to go after, and when do you actually want to try to regulate the underlying technology? This relates to a comment that I made earlier, which is why we need public interest technologists. it may be that some of these issues can at least be partially addressed at the design stage. And I'll give you an example of that. And that is that there's a community of people who work in the field of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and they're committed to principles of fairness, accountability, and transparency. So if we use machine learning, so that there was a company that acknowledged that the algorithms that they were using for hiring were biased against women because the algorithms had been trained on historical data at a time when there were many more men and fewer women. And so the algorithms would be more likely to recommend men than women because they've been trained on historical data. So if the data that you're using to train these systems reinforces existing biases and inequities in society, that's a good example of a risk. And so there's now a research community that is devoted to trying to figure out how to measure that. So what does fairness mean? If you're trying to develop an algorithm that is fair, how would you define that? And how can we develop tools that make it easier for people to develop algorithms that are fair? So that doesn't mean that we may not also need changes in public policy, but those changes in public policy are going to be easier if the technical community is actively engaged in the issue and has done some work to try to operationalize some of these concepts.
Fantastic, yeah.
So, so technology has an extensive potential to help people. So in your view, what are some non-obvious ways that technology could be used to solve the world's biggest problems?
Some non-obvious ones. Well, I want to talk about why do we need public policy to address these issues. So I think one of the things that some people would say is, well, why does government need to do anything, right?
Right.
Entrepreneurs will just develop these technologies and consumers will buy them and, everything will be great. Well, there are, so a couple things. One is that if you look at the actual history of technology and say, where did this come from? In many cases, certainly in the United States, those technologies have their antecedents in government-supported academic research. So famously, the internet grew out of a project called the ARPANET, which was started in late 1969. The first graphical web browser was developed by an undergraduate student at the time, Mark Andreessen, who's now a very well-known venture capitalist, when he was at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Google was developed at Stanford as part of an NSF-funded project called the Digital Library Initiative. GPS was developed by the military. The advanced transistors that are used in semiconductors were developed by researchers like Chen-Ming Hu and Sujay King at UC Berkeley. So that's one thing. If you say, like, where did these technologies actually come from? They often have their roots in government-sponsored university research at places like Stanford and Berkeley and MIT and Carnegie Mellon. The second thing is that there are many technologies and innovations that have a high social return but a low private return. So a good example of that is vaccines for diseases of the poor. So left to their own devices, most pharmaceuticals are not going to work on vaccines for diseases of the poor because the poor people don't have money. So from the point of view of a company that is responsible to shareholders, that's not a very attractive market for them to go after. Right. So economists have come up with very clever solutions to solving these problems. And one is called an advanced market commitment. So an advanced market commitment is a legally binding pledge to purchase something that doesn't exist yet. So as a result of this idea, and it was developed by economists like Michael Kramer, who recently won the Nobel Prize in economics. 5 countries in the Gates Foundation went to GSK and Pfizer and said, if you develop a vaccine for this disease, which is safe and effective, we commit upfront that we will buy so many million doses of the vaccine. And that eliminated the 10 to 15 year lag that usually exists between when a vaccine is available in wealthy countries like the US and when it's available in developing countries. So there, in addition to scientific and technological innovation, we also need policy and institutional innovation so that in those instances where the private sector, for some reason, won't solve the problem, we don't just sit back and say, well, I guess that's all there is to it. It's not profitable to develop vaccines for diseases of the poor, so I guess we can't have those vaccines. We can. We just need to recognize that there are certain classes of problems that markets do a bad job of solving it. And we need these types of clever interventions that will motivate the private sector to solve these problems.
Right, so before we move on to questions from the audience, I would just like to ask you a couple last questions. So what advice would you give to high schoolers who are interested in technology and innovation policy? Like, how does somebody pursue a career in public policy and technology?
I don't think that there's a single route. So, I think the world of public policy, it does not have a well-defined ladder in the same way that, if you want to become a full professor at a university, first you become a graduate student and then a postdoc and then an assistant professor and then an associate professor and then a full professor. Or, if you were to go into the business world, you might, start off as a entry-level worker and work your way up to CEO. And so there's nothing like that sort of well-defined career ladder. One way in which people do that is they get scientific and technical training first, and then they do a fellowship like the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that gives them exposure to science policy, either working in the executive branch or the Congress. And then, they get a taste for it and decide whether this is something that they want to continue to do. I happened to get my start in presidential campaigns. So most presidential campaigns have something called the Issues Department. They're responsible for developing the policy platform of the candidate. So generally a candidate will say, if I'm elected president, I will do X, Y, and Z. Our job was to come up with those ideas. So that's how I got my start in public policy.
So
I love that. Yeah, we'll jump into audience questions. Thank you so much for that, Tom. That was just fantastic. I think I'll start the audience questions to everyone in the call to put the questions in the chat so I can read them out, or unmute yourself and put them out. So I think my question for you, Tom, would be, I often struggle with the relationship between the technology, between the tech industry and the government, right? So on issues like encryption, I'm tempted to side with Apple. I'm tempted to side with WhatsApp when they refuse to break their encryption. Sure. To open a backdoor for the government. But on issues like Facebook's refusal to get rid of hate speech, or publishing ads, political campaigns with fake news, I'm like, no, the government needs to regulate them, right? So there is this weird, like I'm constantly confused who's good or who's bad. And I know it's a gray world, but how do we build a framework that allows us citizens to put pressure on tech companies and governments? And how do you navigate this relationship? Yeah,
no, I mean, I don't think that you should assume that, the government is always right, or the government is always wrong, or the tech industry is always right, or the tech industry is always wrong. I think that you want to start off with, some view about what is in the public interest, and then say, well, okay, given the values that I have, what do I think is the right thing to do in this particular instance? And I think that I think it's useful to have a set of principles, but I think that inevitably the application of those principles is going to depend a lot on the particular facts. And so I think that there's nothing wrong with taking sort of a case-by-case approach and coming to different conclusions in different instances.
Amazing. Awesome. I believe Siddhant has a question next. I feel like I'm putting Siddhant on the spot.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. Yes, Siddhant.
Yeah. Do you believe like technology will play or like has played a key role in a country's foreign policy?
Yeah, so we see that already with the debate between U.S. And China on technologies like 5G, and the U.S. is actively discouraging countries from purchasing Huawei equipment. I think there's also the question about the relationship between the architecture of a technology and whether it's encoding particular human values. So, for example, if an authoritarian government wants technology that is easier to surveil its population, as China is doing with the Uyghurs, for example, and then they are exporting that technology, then the question is whether they're exporting those values, right? So that's why the UK has proposed creating an organization called the D10, which are 10 democratic countries that are also significant players in technology, to say, well, there's a distinction between how democracies, with all their flaws, view technology and the relationship between technology and democracy, technology, and human rights, and the way in which authoritarian governments may view technology. So that's an instance in which it's already beginning to have an impact on foreign policy.
So you work at Schmidt Futures, an initiative aimed at helping young people make a difference. So in your opinion, what role does the youth play in making change?
Well, a couple things. I think, we've seen in climate or in gun violence, in instances in which young people have been able to have an impact just by being active. So I think that's one role. I think the other thing is that they can begin to have an impact on educational institutions. So one of the ideas that I'm interested in is that students should major in a discipline but minor in a problem. And what I mean by that is, that students often think about, well, I'm going to major in a discipline, and so I'm defined by what discipline I'm studying, whether it's economics or political science or computer science or molecular and cell biology. But maybe an important part of a student's identity would be, what's the problem that I want to help address by the time that I graduate? Maybe it's safe drinking water, or maybe it's fighting climate change, or maybe it's ensuring that technology is not used for surveillance, or whatever that problem is. And then to say, what what is it that students would need to know and be able to do so that they could make an important contribution to that. And by convincing institutions of education, whether it's high schools or universities, that this is what students want, universities would say, well, what if we made the problem a first-class citizen in terms of the pedagogical goals of our institutions? So what if the goal of a university was not just to teach you about computer science, but to say, okay, you want to tackle this problem. What are the curricular, co-curricular, and experiential learning opportunities you need to have so that you can make a really important contribution to solving this problem?
Amazing. I believe Arab has a question next.
Yeah, so what is your opinion on access to technology for all? And there's a reasonable way to not only do that, but do so with a platform which all can access, not just those with knowledge in power or knowledge in English or other languages of power, right? So can we get access to technology for all in India? And can we make sure those who get access can actually use it? And what would be your timeline?
No, it's a great question. Obviously, I think one of the things that we can do is, so, the way we think about this in the United States, there may be some unique challenges in India, but one question is access, right? So there, for example, there are some places in the United States, particularly rural communities, where with respect to high-speed broadband, they may not even have the option of going out and trying to buy that. So that's the first issue. The second issue is adoption. Even if they have the ability to order it, are they adopting it? And if not, why not? Is it affordability, or because they don't really understand the value proposition of using the technology? And then the third is, even if they have access to it, do they have the skills and training to be able to use it effectively? And so I think you want to, when you're talking about issues like the digital divide, you want to distinguish which of those you're talking about. Now, in a multilingual society like India, there may also be challenges associated with how do you provide access to information for everyone. And this is an area where, again, I don't think that technology can always solve these problems, but they can contribute to a solution. And this is an area where better machine translation between, English or other languages and languages spoken by other people could potentially play some role.
That's amazing. So I want to honor your time, Tom. It is 9:30 IST, which means it's 9 o'clock at your time. We still have a bunch of questions. Would you have time for more questions, as you wish?
Sure. I'm happy to answer a few more questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I believe we have a question from Rohit. Rohit, could you unmute yourself and ask the next question?
Yeah, hello. So I had a question, since you mentioned the bridge between technology and public policy. How do you think this could be applied in the Indian context? Obviously, the automobile sector is something which requires extreme restructuring, and maybe even the fintech sector. So in that sense, where do you see India in the future in the areas of technology and public policy?
Well, I mean, actually, I think that there are some things that India has done where India has already demonstrated leadership. And I think a good example of that is the issues around identity. So using biometrics or other mechanisms.
UIDA.
Is an area where I think India has led, and other countries are seeking to learn from India's experience as a way for improving the efficiency of government services, potentially reducing corruption, using that as a platform, not only for government services, but other things as well, like financial services. So I think there are some areas where India has led. I mean, one of the things that I hear from, some commentators of Indian policy, Indian public policy, is that India has to resist the temptation to do too many things. So if India currently has a certain capacity to make and implement policy, and that capacity is limited, it's actually a mistake to say, okay, we're going to do these 50 things, because the risk is that none of them gets done well. And so you would be better off at having a framework for prioritizing problems, and then saying, okay, yes, we have a much longer list of problems, but we're going to work on these 3 first, and we're going to devote our limited capacity. Because remember, public policy is not just about passing a law, it's the ability to implement the law. So this is something that we found out with the Affordable Care Act, which is, it was President Obama's #1 domestic priority, and it was in danger of circling the drain because HHS was having a very difficult time contracting for a website, healthcare.gov, and so the website didn't work, right? And so that's a good example of, it's one thing to pass a law, it's another thing entirely to be able to implement the law. So some people, some economists who based in India have said that there is a risk of the Indian government trying to do too many things and not being able to have great implementation in any of them, as opposed to picking a smaller number of things and focusing on the ability not just to pass a law, but to actually implement it effectively.
Yeah, I think that was
Amazing.
I had a quick follow-up question to that.
Sure.
So does Schmidt Futures deal only with American ideas and projects, or would they be interested in perhaps extending their reach to the Indian context and perhaps supporting some innovation over here?
No, absolutely. So we have a project called Rise,
Right.
which is just getting started, but is meant to be global in nature. And we also have an international collaboration on the role of digital learning platforms, where we've been talking to both Indian companies and Indian philanthropists. So we definitely see some opportunities for collaboration.
So is that just a quick clarification from myself? I was just wondering, like, let's say there's a project which is perhaps interesting for your company, and would you guys be willing to perhaps take that forward, support it, and help it scale up? Assuming the intention is good, the possibilities of wide reach social good is very high. So
Yeah, so it depends. So like a lot of foundations, we identify particular priorities. Again, going back to my earlier comment, we're more likely to be successful if we concentrate our activities in a handful of areas where we think we have some expertise, and
Right.
we have some notion about how our investments could help contribute to the solution to a particular societal problem. So, I think one of the things to know about foundations is that the world is very large and complicated, and there's no shortage of problems. And so one of the ways in which a philanthropic organization copes with that is they say, well, we can't solve every problem using every theory of change in every country. We have to specialize. And so a lot of philanthropists eventually decide that they have to have a focus, so that those couple of areas that they decide to concentrate on, they can have a larger impact.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tom. I believe there's a question from Husna, which I think would be our last question. Yes.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you so much, Tom. This has been really interesting hearing all these insights into the workings, sort of often behind the scenes. And I was interested to hear how you mentioned nanotechnology as one of the projects that has sort of withstood progressive governments. And it's always interesting to think of the other things that may have been lost between governments, things that were really amazing ideas and could have benefited humanity and society, but just simply because of a lack of support by the next government have just been lost or slipped between the pages. So I was just curious if there were any things that you might be happy to sort of share.
Well, I'll talk about one area where unfortunately we had the idea, but it also required getting congressional support, and we weren't able to do that. So, one of our most effective research organizations within the federal government is DARPA, the agency that invented the internet. And so at DARPA, the program managers say, well, if you don't invent the internet, then you get a B. So it's it's an organization that has very ambitious goals. And so for problems related to national security, we have organizations like that have over $3 billion in budget, and they don't actually do the research themselves, they fund the research. And so a number of us said, well, what if we had an organization like that, but one that was solving some other problem, not just national security, but education? That's a really important problem. And so we were able, so President Obama supported this, it was included in his budget. We wrote up a paper about like what it might do, what are the types of projects that it would support. And unfortunately, we were unable to convince the Congress to support this. So that's one, I continue to think that's a good idea. There's some philanthropic work that's going on that's related to that, but I think that having organizations that support high risk but high return research in other areas, not just in national security, but in education and workforce development. We now have one in energy called ARPA-E, which I think is underfunded. It has a budget of around 300 million now. I think it could easily be $1 billion or 2 billion. So that's a funding model that I would like to see used more widely, because it's been very successful in the national security area.
Amazing. Awesome. I believe Nandan does have a final question, which he wants to ask. So Nandan, over to you.
So we've talked about a lot of serious issues today, and you've given us a lot of insight, but I just want to find out more about you. So what's your favorite movie?
What's my favorite what?
Movie.
Oh, Seven Samurai.
Wait,
Yeah.
really? Oh, that's the original Star Wars, right? That's where Lucas got the Star Wars idea from, right?
It may be. That's a good question. Yeah. No, it's a long movie, but well worth watching.
That's an interesting answer. Perfect. Radha and Janani and Nandan, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much. Radha, do you want to showcase your forum quickly? Is that something you want to do, or? Okay.
So I'm just gonna screenshot. Oh, can you enable, please?
There you go. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I'm just screen sharing my SDG forum. It's the nonprofit, and so basically it's just kind of like a social media, but solely for the SDGs. The inspiration was kind of Greta Thunberg saying there isn't anything that's just for the SDGs, because she was posting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. And so that's why I created this. And this is the homepage. So you see all the trending posts, and then here we have the feed. So on the mobile app, this is more convenient. But so yeah, here are all the recent posts. You can create quizzes. So this is a quiz created. This was a video that was posted by me from our last speaker. And then this is actually Janani's extension. So I'll show you in my profile. Oops. So here I'll go to my content, and so these are all the posts I've created. So I can post. So here I posted the Google form link. This was registering for your talk. And then this is Janani's extension. So here I'll just click on it, and then Janani, you can screen share and show your extension.
I'll do that. I'll show you. I'll just show off. Give me a second. Janani, do you want to describe what you've built?
Right. Yeah, sure.
So here we are taking a road trip from my home in Delhi to Janani's school in Bangalore. And we're going to quickly see, Janani, what are we going to do? Why don't you say?
Right. So it'll kind of show you your carbon footprint in real terms, such as like the pounds of coal burned, and it also gives you an option to offset your carbon footprint so that you can plant a certain amount of trees to kind of offset your carbon footprint.
So I can click on this button and it takes me straight to the place where I can donate 20 trees, which is how much we imagine you'll have to plant to offset just that road trip. Perfect. That's what these girls have been working on, Tom. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to leave us with?
Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for making time. I know it means the world to all of us. And thank you. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate it.
No, happy to do it. And great questions from everyone.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much for showing up. We will have a recording. We will charge you $200 to see it. That's how we make it. Bye-bye, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.